By a series of coincidences, I'm on a plane to Florida. I'm going to meet a French professor of forensic pathology. We're going to discuss the notorious case of the Hay poisoner, who ranks in the annals of criminal history with Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen. In 1922, Herbert Rouse Armstrong was accused of poisoning his wife Catherine with arsenic, and after a sensational trial was found guilty and hanged. Armstrong's guilt had never been an issue until after a series of inexplicable coincidences, I found myself thrown into his life. The small market town of Hay-on-Wye straddles two counties and is half in England and half in Wales. When I came here 20 years ago to practice as a young solicitor, I knew nothing of the Hay poisoner, as he came to be called, or that I was about to start work in his office. This is Armstrong's office. This is his desk. This is his chair. I turned up in 1976, and it had almost been untouched since 1920. When I came here, yes, I found it was Armstrong's office, but I wasn't interested in the story because I believed, as everybody, or most others did, that juries did not make mistakes, because the story was that he was giving Catherine repeated small doses of arsenic and watching her die in agony and pretending that he was very fond of her and reading to her at night. And if you sort of think of the personality profile of somebody like that, I mean, you're dealing with a very obnoxious person. But even after 60 years, there was still a lot of gossip about Armstrong and the arsenic and the hanging. But once the locals began to accept me, they would bend my ear and they'd say, "You know, he really didn't do it, Martin." They all had their theories about the case. Some even suggested that he'd been framed. Clearly, Armstrong was a popular and respected man. But I had a young family and a new job, and I just didn't want to know. 10 years and 2 houses later, I found myself living in Armstrong's old house, and I began to think that perhaps something very, very strange was happening to me. Here was Armstrong's study. On the opposite wall is the cupboard where he kept his arsenic. My daughter was sleeping in the dead woman's room, as we called it. Was it simply coincidence that my life was becoming further entwined with his? Why wouldn't this story leave me alone? I started to read up about Armstrong, and it was all pretty tabloid stuff. But it was the first step on a journey which would obsess me for years to come. Home of discontent, suspicion. Major Herbert Armstrong was one of the best-known figures in this quiet Welsh border town. It seemed incredible to suspect him of murder. And it goes through the investigations. Herbert Rouse Armstrong had poisoned his wife Catherine and had been hanged. He had 3 children, Eleanor, Pearson, and Margaret the baby. Eleanor had died and Pearson had disappeared. Amazingly, I managed to contact Margaret and a correspondence began. Right, let's get on with it. At first, she was reluctant to discuss the affair, but eventually she agreed to see me. Margaret was only 5 when her father was arrested, so her recollections of it all were buried deep in her memory and clouded by disgrace.
I remember my mother as a shadowy person in bed, and she must have been teaching me even though she was in bed, because I didn't go to school due to the upset until I was 7, and yet I was well up to date, that I was very much Daddy's girl. But I do remember saying that if only all these nasty policemen would go away and let me talk to the judge, I was sure he'd let Daddy and tell him what a nice man Daddy was. So you have that memory then? I'm sure they'd let Daddy come home. That was really the only memory I had.
Did you understand what had happened, that suddenly your father had died? Or?
I knew that my father had been hung.
You knew that?
I always knew that. And I think I knew that he'd been hung for murder. And I didn't know that he was supposed to have murdered my mother until I would be about, I suppose, about 10 or 11.
Margaret agreed to release the defence case papers, and I obtained the prosecution file too. Perhaps something buried in these millions of words might provide a clue to all the speculation about the case. If Armstrong had been wrongly hanged, was he asking me to put it right? Major Armstrong, as he came to be called, came to Royal Hay in 1906 to join a firm of solicitors. When his senior partner died, Armstrong took over the business, and business was good. Over the years, Armstrong had risen to become a pillar of the local community. He held several responsible public positions, including church warden here at St. Mary's, and he was also clerk to the magistrates' court in Hay, and he had risen to be master of the local Masonic lodge. His wife Catherine, on the other hand, was highly strung, physically weak, and susceptible to ailments. In the summer of 1920, she was suffering from delusions and paranoia. No medicine seemed to work, and the local GP, Dr. Hinks, certified her as insane. She was taken to a lunatic asylum where she remained under medication for the next 5 months. That summer, the garden at Mayfield had been plagued with dandelions. Armstrong later testified that according to a gardening tip he'd cut out from the Times, a preparation containing arsenic and caustic soda was the favoured remedy. He purchased the ingredients from Mr. Davis, the local chemist. He then set about the garden lawns with individual doses of arsenic, which he believed would bring an end to his dandelion problem. But it didn't, because we've still got them to this day. So I've ended up living in Armstrong's old house. It's a bit weird, I know, but I've been living here very happily for the last 9 years with my wife Noelle and my 3 children.
Hello. Hello.
I work in Armstrong's old study, and my daughter Morwenna sleeps in Catherine's old room. And as the years have passed, I've been drawn deeper and deeper into the Armstrong case. When Catherine returned to Mayfield from the asylum, she was still depressed, but by now she only weighed 6.5 stone. Within a few days, she threatened suicide, and her health began to deteriorate again. There was isolated vomiting and bouts of delirium. Dr. Hinks was a regular visitor, but despite his efforts, she made no progress whatsoever.
Now, this is Morwenna's room now, but originally it was where Mr. and Mrs. Armstrong used to sleep, and then when Mrs. Armstrong became ill, Mr. Armstrong moved across and slept in the room which is just opposite.
Catherine Armstrong was dying. By this stage she was permanently attended by a nurse, and as well as medicines prescribed by Dr. Hinks, she had numerous bottles of homeopathic medicines which she continued to take, some of which contained small quantities of arsenic. On the night of the 21st of February 1921, bedridden and weak, Catherine Armstrong sank deeper and deeper. She wakened briefly in the middle of the night and asked for Herbert before lapsing into a coma. The following morning, Armstrong sat at her bedside for an hour. The doctor was called, but said he could do no more. 1 hour later, at 10 a.m., Catherine Armstrong died.
It can be scary at times.
It can be at night.
At night. In this room it is scary, especially on the night when she died.
After a short holiday abroad to get over the loss of Catherine, Major Armstrong returned to Royal Hay. It seemed that nothing had changed.
4:20.
But there was talk of a new solicitor in town, a man called Oswald Martin. It was said by the locals that unlike the Major, Martin was a very ambitious chap, and as a solicitor specialising in tax affairs, his business was booming. He'd applied to join the Hay Lodge, and he'd already married the chemist's daughter. Then there was a seemingly innocent, though unusual, occurrence. Oswald Martin was surprised to receive an anonymous gift through the post, a box of expensive chocolates. When Martin had his two brothers and their wives to dinner, the chocolates were duly offered, and Martin's sister-in-law indulged herself. The next day she was mildly ill, and Martin called his father-in-law, Mr. Davis, the chemist. Meanwhile, relations between the two solicitors had become strained. Martin refused to complete a land deal with one of Armstrong's clients, and he sent the Major several brusque notes about the matter. Despite their professional dispute, the Major invited Martin to tea at the house, and although he clearly despised the Major and had no idea why he'd been invited, Martin accepted. Martin later testified that they had not discussed matters of business, but the Major had uncharacteristically picked up a scone and passed it to him on a plate with the words, "Excuse fingers." The tea party was not a lengthy affair, and at 6:30 Martin left. After returning home, Martin ate a supper of jugged hare and caramel cream, and that night he was violently sick. But the doctor was not called until the following day, when he prescribed some bismuth. That afternoon, when Davis met the doctor, he accused Major Armstrong of poisoning his son-in-law Oswald Martin. Naturally, the doctor thought this preposterous, until Davis told him that the Major had in the past purchased arsenic from his chemist's shop. And then Davis produced the box of chocolates. Perhaps, he suggested, they had arsenic in as well. The doctor was alarmed. He asked Davis to immediately obtain a urine sample from Martin. A London laboratory confirmed that there was arsenic in Martin's urine, and 2 of the chocolates had indeed been tampered with. The investigation began. Major Armstrong was wearing his gardening coat when he popped into his office on New Year's Eve 1921. Not long after, the police arrived to question him. They interrogated him for over 6 hours, and when they searched him, they found a small packet of arsenic left over from his gardening experiments. He was cautioned and then charged with the attempted murder of Oswald Martin. Major Armstrong was taken to Hay Jail, and the little town of Hay was buzzing with the news that night as they welcomed in the new year. Now the jail is a bed and breakfast owned by Bob and Marina Knight. This is the original police station and the courthouse. And as we go in, you'll see the original cell where Armstrong stayed for the first 4 days of his committal and after his arrest, where he was banged up.
There were 2 more cells outside. Then there was a door that led into the courtroom, and the public or whatever came in through another door.
By the time the magistrates arrived, the newspapers and photographers were already there. They were even in the court. When Herbert Rouse Armstrong faced the bench in Hay, it was not in the position he usually occupied as their clerk. And you're related, aren't you, to one of the people who used to work at Mayfield?
Yeah, she was my auntie, the maid.
What, Ines
Wasser. She was a real old granny, and she would hold a shawl up to shield his face, so no one could photograph him outside here. From what Mum said, that, you know, I don't think he did it.
Well, did he or didn't he? That's the question everyone was asking. The Major's arrest had made front-page news, and the nation's eyes were focused on the little town of Hay. This is the spot where Catherine Armstrong was buried in February of 1921, and from this spot she was exhumed in January 1922. So while Herbert Armstrong was sitting in the dock, less than a mile away, the gravediggers of Hay were about to exhume his wife's body. But they did not take the coffin out of the ground until that night, with the arrival of the country's leading forensic pathologist, Dr. Bernard Spilsbury. The coffin was then lifted out of the ground and carried by torchlight to Church Cottage across the road. In the post-mortem they carried out that night, a huge quantity of arsenic was found in her body.
Where did she go once they've...
They put her back in a coffin and dropped her back in the hole and filled it up.
Yeah, but she's not there now, like us.
Yes, she is.
Well, how come she hasn't got a sign on?
Because they wouldn't mark her grave again. Because the members of the public would come and look and go up and chop bits off a gravestone. So she's in an unmarked grave.
They're all a bit...
They're all real, aren't they?
Well, they're sort of odd, really.
An autopsy in the middle of the night. Arsenic in the scones. A murderer here in this house. Armstrong was finally committed for trial at Hereford Assizes.
I don't remember at all.
I mean, when the trial was going, I think you did go to Hereford with Ellen and Sonny, but...
Well, I don't know. I don't know where we went. I don't remember that at all.
When Herbert Rouse Armstrong was led from the courtroom cells, he was not on trial for the attempted murder of Oswald Martin. He was being tried for the murder of his wife. The trial was a sensation and the press had a field day. Crowds gathered daily to hear the latest reports. The trial judge, Mr. Justice Darling, was a hanging judge, not known for his jurisprudence or his charitable nature. When I'm sitting in a judge's seat, whenever I've appeared in this court, I've been on the solicitor's bench or sitting behind counsel. But I mean, it's a very strange feeling. I mean, I'm only thinking about 1922, where Mr. Justice Darling sat, and what must have gone through his mind. The courtroom was packed to capacity. The evidence presented by the Crown appeared damning, but it was all circumstantial. The packet of arsenic, Martin's urine sample, Catherine's post-mortem. Then the key evidence was presented by the forensic pathologist, Dr. Bernard Spilsbury. He testified that Catherine had died from a fatal dose of arsenic, which must have been administered within 24 hours of her death. After 6 hours of cross-examination, Armstrong still maintained he was innocent. The defence claimed Catherine must have committed suicide, but the Crown was out for blood. "Do you honestly believe it credible," said Justice Darling, "that a woman in the condition she was got up with the intention of committing suicide? If the theory of Dr. Spilsbury that she must have had a fatal dose within 24 hours is correct, then the whole line of the defence is gone." Justice Darling's direction to the jury amounted to lynch law. Catherine died of arsenic poisoning. Armstrong had arsenic, therefore he murdered her. The jury returned after only 40 minutes deliberation. They found Herbert Rouse Armstrong guilty of murder. And this is the exact spot where Mr. Justice Darling sat when he's facing, he's looking at the prisoner, and he's now going to sentence him to death. Armstrong was taken from the court to await execution at Gloucester Prison. On the 31st of May at 8 a.m, they broke Herbert Rouse Armstrong's neck. The hay poisoner was dead. My researchers had revealed massive inconsistencies in the prosecution case. Evidence of the Tea Party was given, but the chocolates never featured in the trial, and the role of the chemist Davis was never questioned. I also suspected that Spilsbury's evidence may have been flawed. Armstrong was hanged on expert opinion. Spilsbury maintained that Catherine had ingested a lethal dose of arsenic during the last 24 hours of her life. How could he be so dogmatic about the arsenic in Catherine's body when it had been underground for 10 months? I went to see Professor Bernard Knight, the Home Office pathologist who'd given evidence in the Fred West case. Maybe he could help.
My first point is
yes,
that you cannot say, right, there's X in the cecum and there's Y in the liver.
Right.
And that is what happened when she died. Or that was the situation when she died.
And
that's not valid.
Why can't you be certain?
Because she's been in a underground for a year.
Yeah.
You get marked diffusion of everything post-mortem. And therefore what might have started off in the lower left abdomen might end up in the right side of her chest. The distribution found at the exhumation almost certainly doesn't represent the distribution that pertained at the time of death.
What do you think? What do you think of Spilsbury, as a sort of, you know, in your
totally dogmatic, inflexible, dangerous man?
Right.
We're talking about exhumations here. We are now very careful in fresh autopsies to take these samples from the correct place. Even the day later, if you take blood from the wrong place, you'll get the wrong answer. And 10 months later, it's going to be grotesque.
Right.
This could never happen today, given an adequate defence. These contentions of Spilsbury to be blown out of the water. On the medical evidence, Armstrong could not have been convicted today, not with a decent defence with medical backup.
So I was on the right track. Spilsbury's evidence was suspect, and that was pleasing. Professor Knight's analysis was encouraging, but it wasn't conclusive. What I needed now was confirmation from an expert in arsenic poisoning. So that's why I'm on a plane to Florida to see Dr. Gerard Quatreon. He's one of a handful of arsenic specialists in the world. I'd come so far down the road to proving Armstrong's innocence that I was pretty sure that Dr. Quatreon could provide the final nail in the prosecution's case. But now I'm here on this tropical campus, I not only feel nervous but a little out of place. It's a long way from Hay. I'd asked the doctor to compare Catherine Armstrong's data with a leading case study he'd observed in France, where the patient had been kept alive for 8 days after taking a fatal dose of arsenic. Spilsbury at the time of the trial said the cause of death had to be arsenic poisoning, that arsenic had to have been taken within 24 hours of death.
Perhaps the explanation is that the toxic concentrations change, and we know, for example, for barbiturates that they increase a great deal. So it's impossible to say that the high concentrations in stomach or intestine is really reliable in this case, because it was 10 months after death. So it's possible that inside the organism you have a redistribution or a diffusion of the toxics. It's difficult to be sure that it was 4 hours before death or 24 hours before death or a few days before death.
Well, there you have it. Spilsbury was wrong. So now I'm totally satisfied, and I've expert evidence that Armstrong should not have been hanged. But is it possible to determine exactly what happened? I thought this trip to Florida may have also given me a clue about Catherine's death. But I'm still forced to speculate. Was it an accident, or was it suicide? The truth lies buried with her, together with her pain and suffering. There's so much other evidence which never came out at the trial. A very vital letter she wrote shortly before her death ended in these words, "I am in despair." We will never know if Davis the chemist poisoned the chocolates, or if Oswald Martin was poisoned at all. All the evidence I've gathered over the last 10 years tells me Armstrong was framed, but I cannot prove it. What I can prove is that the trial was a miscarriage. If it goes on to haunt me further, I believe a royal pardon may be the only answer.
If it doesn't happen, then it doesn't happen. I'm not building on that. Because to me, the fact that he was wrongfully convicted means that therefore he would not have been executed. And if he'd not have been executed, I wouldn't have spent the next 73 years feeling guilty and lying my way right, left and centre and knowing I wasn't being believed.